number of years ago, you get those annual New Year cartoons that come out, and I remember it was one of those political cartoons, and it was the old man from the prior year and the little baby from the new year, and the old man standing there looking at the little baby with pity drawn upon his face, and he says, "I am so sorry. You're an election year." So anyhow, that's kind of how I feel about every 4 years. So that's life. That's life. But I tell you what, if I had one thing I want you to know this morning, it is simply this, and I don't care about your politics, but Jesus wins. This is just a known fact. This is the reality that we live in. We've got to stop living in fear, and we've got to stop living in, I don't know, what's the word I want to use? Consternation, and this overwhelming, getting wrapped up in politics. And listen, you're talking, this is my soul. I used to allow myself to just get wrapped up so much. I mean, you want to talk about heartburn and all those things. The closer we would get to November, it was misery. The last 2 election cycles, the Lord has just allowed me to not be that way, and I'm so grateful for His grace to me. And I just want to let you know that Jesus wins. Can I just do that? If the party that you fear gets elected, or the party that you love gets elected, doesn't really matter. Jesus is going to win. If a mutated COVID-21 eats our breakfast next year, Jesus wins. I know that's what they're talking about, and the news cycle is designed to get you to stress to the point where you just watch the next news cycle. And I think Christians, we have to strike that balance and find out where it is to being informed, right? And then living in this idolatrous fear. And we can't do it. We can't do it. We've got to trust that Jesus is going to win. We are under command to be a force for good. That's what we're under command, to do the good things. In fact, to live such good lives, and He didn't mean just be good people, but do such good things, live such good lives amongst the pagans, amongst the people who don't know Him, so that on the day of His visitation, they will be able to glorify your Father in heaven. Which in some way, I would just, and this is not my sermon, so I have to step away from this, but in some way is enough to say that live such good lives, be so out loud about the reality of Jesus Christ and the gospel in your life, so that on the day of Christ's visitation, they will also have Christ in their life. But can I remind you, dear Christian, in this election season, that you are a citizen first, primarily, exclusively of the kingdom of God. Christ's kingdom is superior in every single way to anything and everything in this world, and that is a good thing because Christ's kingdom is the only one that will endure. Jesus wins. Let's take a look at Revelation 18. We have to cover it in one go again, just like we did with Revelation 17. And it was a challenge for me last week because there's just so many details that I want to extract. But we've already, in journeying through Revelation, and I'm so thankful for YouTube because they're on there now, but going through Revelation, we've been able to look at a lot of the details and a lot of the minutiae, but so much happens all at once in chapter 17 and 18, really detailing the same event from different perspectives, the ultimate fall of Babylon, we'll deal with that, and the victory of Jesus Christ. I mean, I just can't wait to chapter 19. You guys know what's in chapter 19? The return of our Savior. So I'm looking forward to chapter 19 when we get there. It won't be this week, I'm afraid, but as we delve into Revelation 18, we have to cover it in one go, and so I want you to just imagine, instead of looking at the details, just kind of raising the camera a lot higher and trying to get a picture of the overview. And so we've already read, thankfully, in Revelation 18, and you can go back and do that. But we'll just, as we pick up, very first phrase is after these things. That just means this is the next thing that I saw. We can't make too much out of that phrase, after these things, because Revelation is not a book about chronology. As much as we want it to be about chronology, it's not about math, it's about meaning, it's not about the sequence of events, it's about the ultimate victory of Jesus Christ over a world that is absolutely dead set against Him. He wins. And so, after all of these declarations we've gone through in chapter 17, regarding the fall of Babylon, we get into the response. And that's what chapter 18 is all about, the response to the fall of Babylon. And it comes out in 4 voices. or 4 sayings or 4 events, but I'm going to say 4 voices of revelation. And here's the very first voice, is the voice of celebration, and it comes to us in the first about 3 verses. You get this angel that comes down out of heaven. He's a different one. We've been introduced again and again, and then another angel, and then another angel. One of the reasons for that, one of the reasons we keep seeing a different angel, a new angel, another angel, a different angel, is for a couple of reasons, but I think primarily among them is that God has established a hierarchy, if you will. God is a God of order. Paul writes this to the Corinthian church. The Corinthian church is, of course, kind of devolving into a little bit of chaos. They're not exactly following rules of decorum. I guess that's maybe one way of putting it. And Paul writes to the Corinthian church. He says, look, you guys need to get yourselves under control. If you got one prophet that wants to stand up and speak, let him stand up and speak. But if somebody else stands up and says, I've got a word from the Lord, then you sit down. And you go ahead and stand up. Let's do decorum here. Let's follow things in a way that is proper, in a way that's organized, because God's a God of order, not of disorder. And of course, we see that in the very opening section of the Bible in Genesis chapter 1. God creates everything, and everything is just kind of in this pile. And then out of this pile, God begins to organize the universe, if you will. So we just see God being a God of order from the very beginning all the way to the very end. Well, anyhow, you've got this angel is another one. He's coming down from heaven. And his place of origin matters because we are seeing an angel who is obeying, who is representing God. He's coming out of heaven. And the second thing, first of all, I want you to see these 3 things. First of all, he's coming down from heaven. Second, he's described as having great authority. I'm struggling here because I would really like to do a lesson on angelology at this point in time. I'm not going to do it. But again, there is this hierarchy that seems to be established, and we just draw that from a couple of passages. How about just one? And the passage we didn't read today, but you can go home and read in Daniel chapter 10, where we find about Michael, who's called an archangel. If there is an archangel, or if there is an angel in charge, that's what archangel means. If he's the one in charge, that means there's one's under charge, which means there is a hierarchy of order. There's an order that is being facilitated in heaven. So I just want you to notice that this one has great authority. He's got authority over a great many things. Michael happens to be the angel that we read in the book of Jude is put in charge of the people of Israel. That's his task. His task is to tend and to take care and to do the things that God demands that he does for the people of Israel. And presumably other angels have different tasks as well. We're not introduced to many of them, and I told you I wasn't going to do angelology, so I will stop there. Angelology is the study of angels, if you didn't pick that up already. Third thing I want you to see about this angel is he has great glory. And I want you to think about Moses. Is he goes up on the Mount Sinai and he gets the 10 Commandments from God, and he goes in and he speaks with God into the tent of meeting, and then he comes back out of there. But when he's coming down from the mountain, that next occasion, his face is glowing, and all of the people see that his face is glowing, and they freak out and they run away. And that's why Moses ends up having to wear a veil over his face because of this glory. And Paul has some things to say about that we'll have to ignore right now. But Moses was glowing because he was in the presence of God who is glorious himself. And that's what we are allowed to see here about this angel, I think, is that the earth is illumined by his glory, and that is because he is coming out of the Father's presence. So here we have a representative of God. And it's very important that we recognize that. And again, go back to the book of Luke and the beginning of that, as you have Gabriel goes into the temple and he meets with Zechariah while Zechariah is in there performing his rituals, and as he begins to speak to Zechariah, saying, "You and your wife are going to have a baby," and Zechariah asks the foolish question. He says, "Well, how do I know?" and Gabriel's response is, in the vernacular, "Now listen up, buddy. I stand in God's presence. To ignore what I'm saying is the same as ignoring God, so you won't be able to talk for the next 9 months." Basically he puts him in his place, because to be in God's presence means you bear his authority. And so here's this angel who comes out with God's glory. And all 3 of these characteristics point to someone whom we should be paying attention to. And he celebrates the finished task of Babylon's destruction. And again, we got to go back and talk about Babylon. We talked about this last week, but a little bit of a refresher course. If we trace Babylon through the scriptures, beginning in Genesis chapter 11, and then stepping forward into the days of the book of Daniel, if you will, and then stepping forward into the New Testament era, that the city of Babylon becomes representative of 3 particular strands of reality. The first strand being that visited to us in Genesis chapter 11, and that is this outright rebellion against God. God says, I want you to spread out, and the people decide, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to build this tower that is going to be self-glorification, and we're going to celebrate our autonomy. We don't need God. We can be a God unto ourselves. This is a self-deification of us. We are the ultimate decider of what is good and what is evil. It's Genesis 3 all over again. And so you have that first strand of historical Babylon representing from the very beginning the society of people who set themselves up with an intentional disobedience to the command of God and a desire to be fully autonomous without God. Second strand, we have historical Babylon. We see it represented in the book of Daniel. We see it represented in the other prophets, Jeremiah and Isaiah, as they talk about this actual city-state that is ruled by an actual guy by the name of Nebuchadnezzar at one point, Nabopolassar at another time, a couple of other kings. But you have this actual city-state that is taking place in an actual location centered on the Euphrates River, who is responsible for decimating the people of God. And so you have those that want to be completely autonomous from God in the first strand. Second strand, you've got this city-state that wants to destroy the people of God. And the third strand arises in the book of Revelation as we see that the Babylon is recognized as the kingdom of the Antichrist at the end times. And so all three of those streams of thought have to come together kind of like three strings tying together in one single knot when you read about Babylon in chapter 17 and 18. Godlessness, the destruction of God's people, and that society which is utterly antithetical to who Jesus is. So Paul writes to us at the very beginning of the book of Romans, don't be conformed to the world. The world, or the world system, this pattern of thinking without reference to who God is exactly what is in mind when we talk about Babylon. So you have Babylon being representative here of all of those people who probably should know better, but don't. So with those three threads, Revelation forms this picture of, well, I've already covered it, autonomy, destruction, and the Antichrist. Seems from this point that the angel's celebration is completely appropriate, but it seems to run also so completely contrary to the sensitivity of people today, that we would recognize any kind of joy in judgment. But he's celebrating, if you will, Babylon has fallen and the indictment stream comes down. Babylon has become a dwelling place of demons, a prison of every unclean spirit, and very curiously, the location of every unclean bird. And you and I might look at that and think, well, that's really weird. But it has a context, again, taken right out of the Old Testament. The unclean birds, those that were declared in the book of Leviticus to be unclean, were specifically birds of carrion, those that would eat and feast upon death. We see them all over the place. I'm seeing the black buzzards circling, and I'm seeing the crows that are doing their bit, cleaning up the roads. And I guess, they all perform a function, but they become this symbol of those things which are unclean for God's people because they feast upon death. And death is bad because death is directly connected to sin. And anything that is directly connected to sin is destructive, and destruction, therefore, is not good, and God's people aren't supposed to wrap themselves around it. And so when you see these birds that are there, it is a result of the fall that's being taken in here. So in other words, all of the results of sin, all of the results of death and destruction and decay, and all of those things that are bad, the demons and the devils and the, you might think they're the same things or not, in these carrion birds, this frequent picture in the Old Testament of God calling the carrion birds to come feast on the corpses of the enemies of God. So all of these things, this death that is centered on Babylon, the angel is celebrating Babylon's destruction, because if Babylon is destroyed, then death is destroyed, and if death is destroyed, then what's left is the life that's in Christ. And that's ultimately what the vision of Babylon's destruction is about. And so that indictment continues to remind us of stuff we've already seen. And so, really quickly, working through here, Babylon is being accused here of her idolatrous worship of the Antichrist. And that's that language of sensuality. In the Old Testament, that language of sensuality was always wrapped around the idea of not being faithful to God and instead pursuing other gods. It was spiritual adultery. Drawing on that image in verse 3 of the Old Testament of not being faithful to God by worshiping other gods. And that's ultimately the world around us today. And so there's the first voice, the voice of this bright angel celebrating the fall of Babylon because she led the earth astray. And it is just for God to judge those who lead the charge in rebellion against him. So there's the first voice, celebrating, heaven's voice, if you will, celebrating the fall of Babylon. The second voice starts up there in verse 4 and begins to move forward. God's voice directed not to a general audience, not to just kind of everybody, but to his people. He says, my people. I want you to see that. Come out of her. It's this call for separation from Babylon so that we don't share in her sins. And here we have a challenge, and here we have a struggle for us as Christians to try and to navigate exactly what is meant by coming out of her. But let me share with you a couple of verses. First of all, Isaiah 48:40, go forth from Babylon, flee from the Chaldeans, that's the same people, declare with the sound of joyful shouting, proclaim this, send it out to the end of the earth, say the Lord has redeemed his servant Jacob, or the people of Israel. And so this is Isaiah saying, there's going to come this moment in time when I'm going to tell you to get out of Dodge, because Dodge is not the place you want to be. And then just a couple of chapters later, Isaiah 52, depart, go out from there, touch nothing unclean, go out of the midst of her, purify yourselves, you who carry the vessels of the Lord. And there's a call that Isaiah gives to the priesthood and those that would be responsible for carrying the temple furnishings, saying, get up and get out of Babylon, because Babylon is this physically wicked nation, and I don't want you there anymore. And moving them out. And then we could jump over to Jeremiah 51. Flee from the midst of Babylon, and each of you save his life. Do not be destroyed in her punishment, for this is the Lord's time of vengeance. He's going to render recompense to her. Historically speaking, as we look at these prophets, they are talking about this moment of time in which God would judge the physical city, the nation, the city-state of Babylon, where Nebuchadnezzar once ruled, where Belshazzar ruled, and where other kings from the nation, city-state of Babylon had ruled. And in that judgment, they would serve as a small picture of the large end. They're a foreshadowing of what is being described here in Revelation. And so John sees this image, this vision of this celebration and this command, and this voice comes out of heaven, God saying, get out of here, my people, so that you will not participate in her sins. Doesn't that sound exactly like what Jeremiah is saying? We don't want you to be a part and a parcel of her ultimate judgment. Then you got Ezekiel 26, 27, 28, those three chapters together, which every once in a while I like to give you some afternoon reading. So, your afternoon reading today is Ezekiel chapter 26, 27, and 28, and it's going to detail the fall of Tyre, or Tyre, depending on the pronunciation you prefer, Tyre, and it forms a background for you to look at as God destroys the enemy of his people. And that's the imagery, a lot of which is being drawn in this destruction of Babylon. Now, why is all of that being brought together? Because that's the text, that's the Old Testament, that was the Testament that the early church would have been familiar with, and all of this imagery that they had been drenched in for the last several years as they learned what it meant to become Christians, to be followers of Jesus Christ, who had been the author of the Old Covenant, would have learned what it meant to live in the New Covenant. God's patterns don't change. He does the same things, and he does the same things because the old things are mirrors of what is coming. God's righteousness doesn't change, and so he always does the same pattern of righteousness. All right. A lot of background there. God is telling his people not to be a part of this godless culture, and now we have to struggle a little bit, and I hope just a little bit, with the same struggle that Paul was dealing with when he's writing to the Corinthian church. Paul writes to the Corinthian church and he says, I don't want you hanging around with godless people. And then he has to clarify himself. He says, let's just clarify what that means. I don't want you, dear Christians, Paul would write, to be hand in hand, to hold arm in arm with people who are claiming to be Christian, but whose lives are utterly devoid of any Christ-likeness whatsoever. They are utterly and irrepressibly, uncontrovertibly, not repentant. Don't hang around with Christians who really ain't. And then he goes on to say, he says, now, I'm not telling you that you need to get out of the world because, if you get away from sinners, you're going to have to get a rocket and go somewhere else. Here's the problem. When we're about to discover this, if you get on a rocket and you go somewhere else, you're taking sin with you. So that's not going to work either. But Paul is not saying, I'm not saying that you and I, the church fame, we need to go find a place out in the middle of some desert and live a convent-type lifestyle where it's just us four and no more and shut the door. It's not saying separate yourself so utterly from society that you can't reach out to them with the gospel. He's saying don't be like the culture around you. Don't do it. Romans 12. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Don't be conformed to this world. Don't be like them. One of the things that frustrates me is that I myself, and I know I'm not alone, is that sometimes we just want to fit in. But we're not supposed to fit in. Christians ought to be weird. Not in the way I'm weird. I mean, I'm just weird because I have some odd quirks and things like that I happen to enjoy. But we're supposed to be completely contrary to the rest of this world's pattern of living, which is completely without Christ. Why? Because my pattern of living and your pattern of living is supposed to be saturated in Christ. And those two will not mesh. And if we find ourselves meshing with the world, if we find ourselves in a situation where we can just utterly fit in, we might want to second guess our faithful walk with Christ. Because it may not be all that faithful. Well, he says, I want you to come out of her, my people, so that you don't take part in her sins. I don't want you to be like the rest of the world. And so that's why I'm saying this is a very contemporary warning for you and I. This is not just wait till the end of time because we want to escape Babylon when Babylon finally gets here and whatever the Antichrist kingdom finally looks like. Yeah, I don't want to be a part of that. No, I don't want to be a part of this kingdom right now, which is what 1 John would tell us is filled with many, tiny, M-I-N-I, many antichrists. People who are not living in accordance with Christ. I don't want to be like them. I don't want to take part in them who are completely satisfied with this world and who pursue and idolize the things of this world and who do not worship and honor and serve Christ. No, I want to be different. It's not an after-the-fact warning. It's not an early warning, and it's not an idle warning. Remember, God doesn't waste ink. In what sense, then, is he warning us? I think, once again, very much in the way that 1 John warns us, don't love the world. Don't love the things in this world. Because here's the deal. Here's the Tom Black paraphrase version of that passage. Don't love the world or the things in the world, because if you do, you're proving that you don't love Jesus. Period. So, ask yourself, dear Christian, if you are like Babylon, running your life without reference to Christ. I think there's a significant warning there. Submit yourself to God. Are you tempted to exalt the state? Stop it. Are you tempted to exalt the wealth that we could? Stop it. Are you tempted to put all of your comfort on what you collect? Quit it. Are you tempted to maybe enjoy an hour of God on Sunday and kind of forget Him for the rest of the week, folks? No. That's not how this works. Do not love the world or the things in the world, says the Apostle John. That's 1 John 2:15. Because all of it's going to decay. All of this stuff around us is going to turn to ash. Every single part of it. You're called by God Himself to separate yourself from the sinful culture you live in. Do not partake of her sins. Be separated, because her sins, He says, are piled as high as heaven. That's pretty high. And again, do you hear the echo there? Do you hear the echo of Genesis 11 and the Tower of Babel? Her sins are piled as high as heaven. What did they want to do? Let us build a tower up to heaven. They've succeeded. Notice how verse 6 describes this doubling of God's judgment. We've got to do this quickly and kind of move forward through it. That doesn't mean that He's going to punish them twice as much as they deserve. They only deserve 5 lashes. He's going to give them 10. That's not what that means. This is taken from the idea of the one who is in charge, the one who's kind of leading the way. This is taken from the idea of how an inheritance would be handled way back then. Basically, the oldest child, the oldest male in the family, he would receive a double inheritance as compared to anybody else in the family. And that was because the oldest male in the family was going to be responsible when Dad died of taking care of the rest of the family. That double inheritance was, I'm going to give you everything you need to fulfill the role that you have been given. And so this is being reversed. You have taken on the role of leading this world into sin, O Babylon, and you are going to receive everything that you need as a result of it. Verse 7 is going to do the same thing, spelling out an appropriate judgment to the world that had convinced yourself that it would never have to face God. And again, I just see myself seeing contemporary culture here. We don't even have to wait for the future of Revelation because we're living in the middle of Babylon. We're living in a world that is completely antithetical to who God is. And it's not news to us, but I think sometimes we forget the contrast because we're used to living here, and we don't see it. I mean, if you really want to find out what are some of the things that is wrong with your house, have a friend come over with a notepad and say, how about you just walk through my house and point out the things that maybe aren't right? If you were to walk through, you might forget or not notice that ding that's in the wall from when the kids threw the truck 3 years ago. And you might not even pay attention to the fact that one, I got ceiling fans, one of the ceiling fans wobbles. You might not pay attention to the fact that light switch doesn't work and it flips the wrong way. And, it really, and if you were going to sell the house, you should probably fix that. And you wouldn't notice that maybe the scuffs on the ends of the stairs that probably need to have some kind of a thing put on there in order to make it look pretty for the guy who's going to buy it next. I mean, if you're going to sell your house, having another set of eyes come in and take a look at it, that's going to be very helpful. Sometimes Christians, we need that. Another set of eyes to show us the blind spots in our own life. We were talking about blind spots this morning in Sunday school. So it is moving on into this godless personality in in verses 7 and 8. This godless person finding that ignoring God eventually turns to a significant inward turning that has no room left for loving others. And so verse 8 reminds us that Babylon's arrogant absorption is why her plagues will all come at once. God's going to end up judging Babylon. We already know that. We read about that, Pastor, way back in chapter 17 last week, and then we've read about it in the other chapters, 13, when you've got the coming of the beast and all of these other things. It is the Lord who judges her who is strong. And that's directly related to Jeremiah 50:34. Their Redeemer is strong, the Lord of hosts is his name. He will vigorously plead their case so that he may bring rest to the earth, but turmoil to the inhabitants of Babylon. So why the imagery in Revelation is continually about Babylon, because the imagery of the reality, the history that happened to Babylon in the Old Testament forms that backdrop that creates the full image. So you get the first voice, which is the voice of celebration that Babylon has fallen. It's a good thing when God judges wickedness. The second voice is the command, really, for you and I to separate ourselves from Babylon, to not be like the world around us. And this third voice, the consternation of the nations. I just like the way that sounded. I couldn't think of a different phrase, so I just kept using it. The third voice that breaks out is the collective voices of the nations of the rest of the world that participated along with Babylon. All of her decadence, all of the godlessness that amounts to nothing. Not only the nations, but the individuals. And I just can't help but thinking, as I look at, starting in verse 9, this lament for Babylon, it's titled in the New American Standard, this lament for Babylon. If you've got the kings of the earth, and then later on you've got the merchants of the earth, and you've got the sailors, and you've got all of these people groups that are mourning because of what they have lost. And in all of the things that they have lost is wealth. And I can't help but think of Jesus' words in Matthew 16. What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? I mean, right there, you stop right there and recognize there's no profit in there. What will a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in the glory of his Father with his angels and will then repay every man according to his deeds. You've got all of these merchants, you've got all of these sailors, you've got all these kings of the earth, and they're standing at this distance, and they're mourning, and they're weeping, and they're gnashing their teeth because of all of the wealth that they had accumulated had come to nothing. He's talking about this judgment that Matthew is describing. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world, but you forfeit your soul in the process? There's a number of things being pictured here, and I have to try and be selective of what we're seeing. But we're seeing political destruction. So for those of us that might be so inclined as to put all of the weight for everything good or bad that's going to happen is all on this coming Tuesday in November, cool it. Because the political rulers will be judged. I know right now it looks like Kim Jong is getting away with stuff in North Korea. He won't. And I know right now that China is cracking down on Christians and it looks like they're going to win. They won't. God will judge. Does that mean we don't care? It does not mean we don't care. But it does mean that we don't wrap up our happiness, our joy, our future, our hopes upon what happens in the ballot box. Because no matter who wins, Jesus is my king. He's going to win. John lists all of these things that make for wealth, gems and spices and iPhones and nice houses and Mercedes-Benz, I think, is in there. I mean, all the nice cars, all this stuff. You get all these mourning merchants, and this third group takes up that sense of mourning, all the shipmasters and the sailors and the passengers, basically anybody and everyone who has developed and lived as if this earth is all that there is will find in that day of judgment that it is not enough. And folks, that's some of the people that live next door to us. And so I have to ask the question, what are we as Christians supposed to do in the light of God's judgment on an unbelieving world and an utterly godless world system? And the text is here. Rejoice. We should be able to celebrate the fact that, yes, God will judge, because God, rejoice, he says, because God has pronounced judgment for you against her. Don't miss those two words, for you. And I want you to remember how many times already in the book of Revelation, and right at the end of chapter 18, you're going to see it again, how many times we're going to be reminded that the blood of the martyrs fills Babylon's streets. That doesn't necessarily mean that just the capital city of the Antichrist kingdom, but we're talking about this entire world system that is dead set against Christ is the one that's responsible for killing all of the martyrs for Christ. And those two key words are extremely important. We ought to see here that God's judgment is for us. God has pronounced judgment against her for us. And that's vastly different than God has pronounced judgment. So what's for us? What's the... Well, it's consoling. It's a consoling word of encouragement as we look at a world that isn't fair. Has anybody had a perfectly fair week? Have you watched the news and seen crimes happen to people who didn't deserve it to happen? Have you known people who died when they shouldn't have died that early? I mean, we just innately know. This is not the way the world is supposed to work. Things are wrong. Things are broken. This world is not only broken in the way that people die from diseases, but people get killed. And then you have not only this, but you have, yes, there's real wealth inequality. And some of it is not from hard work. Some of it really is from abusing and using a system and using it and abusing it against those who can't defend themselves. And then you do have, even though we live miles and miles away from really having to deal with any kind of racial inequality because we live in white America, but the reality is that it does exist in certain pockets. And it's not fair, and it's not good, and it's not right. And God is saying, I'm going to judge that. And the Christian ought to rejoice that God is going to bring justice to what is unjust. Fourth voice, move quickly to it, and that's desolation. Or I guess the fourth voice is simply silence. Fourth voice begins in verse 21, this mighty angel using a large stone. You know, the millstone could have been as small as, something that a single person could use to mill their grain, or something so large that you had to hook multiple animals to it in order to turn it around. And I think it's that latter one that's in view here, because you've got this mighty angel. He's big, he's tough, and he picks up this stone and he throws it into the sea, and he says, this is what the destruction of Babylon is going to be like. In other words, it's going to sink beneath the surface, and you'll never see it again. Utter, complete destruction of Babylon. It's really about the end of rebellion against God in total. So again, as you're looking at chapter 18, as you look at the destruction of Babylon, Christians, what do we do? Well, what we're looking at in the destruction of Babylon is not merely some future moment in time, but it's the current promise about some future moment in time in which everything that is broken in today's world and everything that has been broken in the world of the past, everything will be brought to God for justice. God is going to do justice finally. The destruction of Babylon is really about the end of rebellion against God completely. It's Genesis 3 erased. It'll be as if the serpent never deceived Eve, and Eve never gave fruit to her husband, and he ate it because he was with her. We have to wonder at the celebration, but we have to recognize that God never judges good. God doesn't judge holiness. God doesn't judge righteousness. And I look at the book of Revelation, chapter 18, and I see the utter destruction of the entirety of Babylon, and I think about all of the lost. And I think how many people And I have to wonder, I ponder in my office as I sit there and I work through the chapter and I think about it. Yes, Lord, I know this, but that means that there are people who are lost. But then I recall that Babylon is the full example of willful, intentional unbelief. Demonstrated at the very end by her participation in the blood of all the prophets and saints, and indeed of everybody who's ever been slain on the earth. Every crime, every injustice, every murder, every wrongful death, every single assault upon the image bearers of God will be brought to a full and complete judgment. In other words, God's justice will be satisfied, and that is worthy of celebrating. And that's the source of our celebration, God's justice visited upon the cause of Christian suffering. And our sins forgiven. What a wide gap that is bridged exclusively by the cross of Christ. The celebration we are called to is appropriate because it is ultimately a celebration of God's righteousness being satisfied. So there's the destruction of Babylon, really a portrayal of not just the destruction of a city that happens to be on earth at the end times, but the reality of God finally bringing full and complete judgment on an entire world system that is determined not to yield to Him. So, Christian, separate yourself from this world. Don't be like the world, and rejoice that someday God will, in fact, judge all sin.